Right, so hello everyone. Uh, Today we're sitting down with, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
My name is Marc Guggenheim. I'm a writer.
And so we are on the WookieCast, Wikipedia's podcast show. And so thank you so much for sitting down with us today. I'd love to get into a little bit of how you first got into Star Wars.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. This is fun. I love Wookieepedia. It's I think impossible to write Star Wars these days without it. Well, the way I got in was I was 6 years old, and my father took me and my brother Eric. Eric at the time was like 4 years old. We were going to go see a movie, and it was going to be like at this mall, the shopping mall, that was like about half an hour away from our house, 45 minutes. And we wanted to go see The Bad News Bears. The Bad News Bears was this movie franchise featuring like these kids who were like, they were all kind of losers and, sort of malcontents and ne'er-do-wells. And, they somehow managed to put it together, and get their act together and win baseball games. And, um, I think we were going to see like the sequel or something. I forget. We wait in line, which back in those days didn't seem all that unusual. We wait in line and then we sit down, and the 20th Century Fox logo comes on the screen, and there's this huge swell of music and these big yellow letters proceeding into the background, that says Star Wars. And by the time the Star Destroyer passes over the lens of the camera, I was like, okay, this is not Bad News Bears. And I was instantly transfixed. I It's hard for me to describe like how much that blew my 6 year old mind. Because and I think one of the reasons why it's hard to explain is you have to understand like sort of what the state of movies was in the early, in the 1970s. And there had never been anything like Star Wars. Nothing. I mean, I know like George was paying homage to, the serials of his youth, like, Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, but there was nothing like this. And it was transformative.
And you couldn't really go stream it either. You had to go to theater and see it.
You had to
So,
go see it in the theaters. It wasn't on, there was no streaming, there was no cable. My dad did, it's funny, like we saw, we saw in the theaters, it ran for a year in the theaters, and we saw it like a million times. Like I remember there was one time where my brother and I wanted to go see it again, and the movie had already started, and my mother's like, the movie's already started. Like, by the time we get there, you'll be like 20 minutes in or something. And I'm like, that's fine. Doesn't matter. We already knew the movie by heart anyway. And we came in like in the middle of the cantina scene. And the funny thing is, like, my father, during that first year Star Wars was out, my father owned, and he still owns, this little electronics shop. And we were the first, people on our block to have a VHS machine, a videotape reporter. And he also did a lot of work with the FBI. And believe it or not, there was still piracy back in those days. So we had from the FBI a pretty pristine pirated copy of Star Wars, that we just ran the tape out. We literally like watched it so many times, like the tape started to like develop these little glitches and stuff. So yeah, so Star Wars made a huge, huge, huge impression on me.
so obviously it's been a big part of your life, but what was the first thing that you wrote for Star Wars?
The first thing I wrote, it was interesting. It was supposed to be I forget how many pages it was. I think it was supposed to be an 8-page Captain Rex story. And like I had sent whenever I do comic book work, yeah, this was, I should say, like, it was a comic book story. Whenever I do comic book work, I always send like a list of potential log lines to the editor, in this case to the editor and Lucasfilm. And they sort of, they picked this particular Captain Rex story, and I forget even what the original story was. It had something to do with Rex's relationship to Anakin, and sort of a lesson that Anakin learns about leadership from Rex. But then, as I was writing it, I got a phone call from Mark Paniccia, the editor at the time, and still the editor of the Star Wars line at Marvel. basically saying to me that could I double the size of the story and work Jar Jar Binks into it? And the reason was that there was going to be, this was an anthology. This was like going to be four stories or something, four short stories set during the Clone Wars, or at least during the Age of the Republic. And the artist, the writer artist who was going to do the Jar Jar Binks story basically bailed out or flaked or something. But the problem is Jar Jar was already on the cover.
Oh,
So
so
to avoid false advertising, there had to be some Jar Jar in there. So they were like, could you basically like double the size of the story and work Jar Jar in? And I did, and it was a blast. I had the most fun. It was an interesting challenge because the story wasn't originally conceived of with Jar Jar in mind. But I think Jar Jar is a very much maligned character, and it was fun to try to make him cool.
yeah, we don't really see a ton of him in the movies. I mean, he gets a whole life afterward in books and stuff,
Yeah.
but you don't really see
S-
him.
See, if I was George Lucas, which I'm not, obviously, but what I would have done, and then this is the contrarian me, is I would have spent the next two movies in the prequel trilogy making Jar Jar as cool as Boba Fett, as cool as Han Solo, and then at the very end of episode three, kill him off. And be like, hey, you wanted him dead,
Now
wish
he's
granted.
dead.
But I think Jar Jar is just he's such an interesting Star Wars character to me. And it was fun. It was fun to do that story.
So one of your longer projects is Han Solo and Chewbacca, the Crystal Run series. What were some of your inspirations when writing that?
Believe it or not, there's a movie with Robert Redford and Paul Newman called Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And it's this movie about these two sort of, you know, they rob trains and they rob banks, and they're sort of like, they're criminals, but not hardened criminals. They're the truth is they're a lot like Han and Chewie. So that movie was a very big influence. And believe it or not, the other big influences were Empire, Jedi, and Force Awakens. And the reason for those three pieces of influence is because those three movies were co-written by Lawrence Kasdan. And Lawrence Kasdan, in my opinion, like he's the voice of Han. Like other people have written Han. Well, I should include Solo also in that too, because he co-wrote that also. And other people have written Han, but no one writes him quite the way Lawrence does. So that was a big influence for me.
We kind of got like slightly into the background with Han's father and stuff like that, which was an interesting tie-in to, I think he got his name originally in Star Wars Legends, so kind of
Yes,
Ovan, was
that's
it?
right. Yes, and and that was an intentional callback to Legends. I mean I'm a big Legends fan. Remember when I was growing up, there wasn't like streaming and there wasn't like TV shows, and we had the Marvel comic series, we had the occasional Del Rey book, and we had the Star Wars Holiday Christmas Special, and that was it. Like our extended universe wasn't all that extensive. So what you got, you really sort of cherished. And a lot of the extended universe and legend stuff, I have a great affinity for it and a great sense of nostalgia for it. So whenever I can, sort of work in at least even an Easter egg, like in the form of a name or a mention, it's always a lot of fun for me.
I always like to say that you can really tell which Star Wars authors love Star Wars, like from the bottom of their soul, because the amount of stuff that works its way in, you can tell that they love the Star Wars.
I tell you, I don't know how you write Star Wars if you don't love it. But then it's funny, like, Tony Gilroy, who, he did Andor, um, he's, and he worked on Rogue One. He, by his own admission, is not a fan of Star Wars. And in my opinion, he's done some of the best Star Wars,
Yeah.
around. So, so it's definitely possible to not be a fan and be great at Star Wars. I don't know how I would do it. Like I don't, I for me it's all about that 6-year-old boy sitting in the theater watching, the Star Destroyer pass overhead.
I guess in his case, he said that he just had a bunch of the Lucasfilm people assign names to all of the props, and that's where the
Oh,
lore came in.
oh,
So,
that's really funny. I didn't know that. I didn't know. I've been joking that if you know, it's sort of it's a subplot that got dropped after the first episode. But I think if Andor, if Andor finds his sister, her name should be If Then. That it's If Then Andor. That's a very dad joke, but I'm gonna get it in there one day.
so in your series for Han Solo Chewbacca, at least, we do see a lot of like tie-in characters, because Greedo was in the films, and then Tonga from Ethan Sack's Bounty Hunter series. What are some other characters that you liked, like putting in there? Just
Well, it's funny. I loved having Grand Moff Tarkin in issue. I think it was like eight, no, yeah, eight or something. It was just fun to write him. And I also really enjoyed like creating some new characters too, because I'm a big believer. This is true for all my comic book work, like all my licensed comic book work is it's fun to play with the toys, but I also like sort of believe in adding some toys to the toy chest. So like, Marshall Bankto and it was a lot of fun. I think having having these different characters in the book is one of the things that made it fun for me. Like it felt like, oh, over the course of 10 issues, you're really getting a chance to meet a whole lot of people. And not necessarily the people you would expect, so
right.
some deeper cuts, as it were. And that was a great deal of fun for me.
Do you have any favorite characters that you're able to introduce, even from any of your runs, really?
I would say definitely. I think Marshall Bankto Buck is definitely probably my favorite. Phaedra, who's this who's this sort of young sort of criminal mastermind who Chewbacca met in prison. She was a ton of fun to write. She was, sassy and smart and a really good foil for I felt Han. And there's a reason why I kept her aboard the Falcon at the end of the 10 issues series because I was, still kind of hoping that one day I get a chance to, sort of do not necessarily a sequel to the Crystal Run, but a continuation so that we could tell some more stories because I think the trio of Han, Chewie, and Phaedra that's just a delightful trio for me.
And I guess that that whole series is set during a time period which they have a lot of time. So there's time in the timeline for it to happen for
There's
sure.
there's nice. It's a big, wide open runway for me, and that would be a great deal of fun to get a chance to re-explore.
So one of your other works, like the D Squad miniseries, it focuses on a lot of droids, so less characters, more droids. But what were some of your favorite parts of that series? Because obviously droids are sometimes speaking of binary, so it's a little bit different.
Yeah, for me, actually, the hardest part was also the most fun part, which is, I try the rule. I every time I work on a comic book, I sort of set a certain rule for myself that sort of is designed to sort of fit what I'm doing. In the case of Star Wars, my rule is I only want to use the narrative tools that are available in live action. So, in other words, in comic books, there's often, first person narration or third person narration, but you don't really have that in live action. So I didn't want to make use of it. Similarly, in live action, the droids, when they speak in binary, it's never subtitled. It's never translated. You have to figure out what they're saying from context clues. So that was another, sort of rule I set for myself. So as a result, having, a droid ensemble, two characters who speak, only in binary, that was an interesting challenge. But it was a really fun challenge. It sort of forced me to be, more clever and make it more entertaining. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that writing 000 is easily the most. I could do that all day long. It's pure fun. He's just a total delight. Um, so it was fun to put these motley, put this motley crew together. They're all such different characters, and they're all they all have different personalities. I think that was really that was one of Star Wars's many innovations is, up to that point in cinema, robots were sort of they were really sort of inhuman. They were cold and calculating and oftentimes the bad guy. But with A New Hope, along comes C-3PO and R2-D2 who have heart and soul and humor, and they have this very human-like relationship and banter. That was really that was truly revolutionary. And I think it's one of the things that makes Star Wars is there's this whole subgroup of droids that all have different motives, different opinions, different ways of expressing themselves, different ways of acting. It was a lot of fun to be able to put all that together into 4 issues.
I guess we kind of see a lot of that in Solo as well when there's like droid rebellion. You see that they're
Yes.
much more than just the restraining bolt in a way.
Yeah, they're more. I love. I love Solo also. I think Solo is such an underrated film. And in large part, like I think Phoebe Waller-Bridge, she steals that movie. And her character steals that movie, and just the whole idea that that the Falcon has a certain sentience to her is terrific. It's a great notion. It really goes back to Empire Strikes Back, where 3PO is literally like Han says, you got to talk to the Falcon, like which implies that the Falcon can talk back, which implies there's a certain sentience there. And I think it's just such a wonderful idea.
So, though much of your work is like in the Imperial area or like Clone Wars, you also got to go back in time a little bit for Yoda series, which has the mainframe story when he's, in exile, but also has all the flashbacks to the Republic era. So, what was that like?
That was really interesting because it was actually the second time I've written Yoda. My very second Star Wars project was a Yoda 8-pager for Age of Rebellion. And I actually ended up screwing up with that without knowing that years later we would do a 10-issue Yoda series. I actually screwed up the whole Yoda series because my 8-page story basically takes place in the moment, or it ends in the moments right before Luke crash lands on Dagobah. And then when we all got together, me, Kevin Scott, and Jody Hauser, to do the Yoda 10-issue series, Kevin had basically created this whole sort of structure, and he was going to end the story with Luke arriving on Dagobah. And like I was like I sort of kept quiet because I didn't want to like rock the boat or anything, and said like actually I've already done that. But eventually, of course, Lucas film pointed that out, and I was like, okay, it's not my fault. I mean, it's my fault, but it's not. I was keeping my mouth shut. But what was so great, and Kevin, of course, in brilliant fashion, came up with a solution I thought worked even better. But the brilliance of the story that Kevin had sort of laid out for Jody and me was that each sort of arc within the 10 issues would focus on a different timeline. And yet again, I got Clone Wars sort of in the lottery. And it's funny, I really love the Clone Wars period. I think there's a reason why that show ran for so long and has had so many spin-offs. And I think it's just a very vibrant, interesting period of Star Wars. It's it lacks it lacks sort of the peacefulness of the pre-prequel era or the High Republic era, but it also lacks the darkness of the Imperial era.
Right.
So it just sort of sits in this very interesting sweet spot of how heroes are sort of made and are given opportunities to shine in times of war. It's just an interesting it raises some interesting thematic things. I fear that I strayed very far away from
No, I
your
love the Clone Wars. It's really interesting to see how the Jedi are slowly falling, but it's not quite fallen. Like the Jedi Order hasn't quite fallen yet, but they can't see it. But the person can see it. So we're watching and we're like, oh no, you should just see him. Sidious is here, but they don't see it.
There's something, yeah, I think that's what it's, there's something very Shakespearean about that time period because you know the clock is ticking on the Jedi Order. And you know, it's really a great example of like the bomb underneath the table. And you want to scream at the screen and go, look under the table, there's a bomb. Like you got to save yourselves. And it's, you know, obviously we know that that doesn't happen, spoiler alert. And I just think it makes for some really delicious dramatic irony, you know, especially knowing, you know, how Obi-Wan ends up and how Anakin winds up and all of those, you know, all of those fun things. It's a super rich, interesting area.
So the Yoda stuff isn't the only stuff you've done in, I'm not sure exactly which part of the Age of Republic, Age of Rebellion, all of those that you wrote, but it all kind of, you've worked in like every era. I said, except for High Republic, I think.
Except I haven't. I've done I like to say I've done a couple of panels in High Republic. So there's a character that I had created for the Crystal Run, called Ajax, who is this, you know, this sort of droid revolutionary, and he actually gets, you know, sort of decapitated, you know, during the High Republic era.
Oh,
Um, and so I spent like a couple of, and I kept revisiting those panels. Like I think we see those panels like in D Squad. We no, not D Squad. We see them in Star Wars Revelations. We see them in Han and Chewie. They may even have made it into the Dark Droid series. So we kept revisiting that moment. I haven't touched the sequel era, you know, the First Order era. And I'm really dying to. That's a definitely a big bucket list, Star Wars bucket list item for me.
do you have any favorite like little short stories out of like the one-offs that you've done within Age of Rebellion, Age Republic?
Um,
You know, because they're all based on different characters.
yeah, you know, it's funny. I still I don't know if it's my favorite. I still am amazed I got away with this. There's a moment in the Captain Rex Jar Jar story where a Jedi's lightsaber ends up in Jar Jar's hands. And Jar Jar gets this moment where he's got an ignited lightsaber, you know, and a sort of I told the artist, like, give us like the most badass looking Jar Jar you're capable of drawing. And it was just so much fun. And then of course, you know, in the very next panel, you know, Jar Jar, like, you know, loses, like, you know, the lightsaber sort of flies out of his hand. It's like it's slippery. And it allowed for, I thought, just a very like a badass moment for Jar Jar, but also in keeping with Jar Jar
It
always, you know.
breaks a moment later. He doesn't
Yes,
have for
exactly.
long.
Exactly. Like he wasn't going to go slaughter, you know, a whole bunch of separatist droids with that lightsaber. You know that wasn't going to happen. So you know that was a lot of that was a great deal of fun. I really enjoyed that. Yeah, I love. It's funny as a comic book writer, I love doing the short 8 or 16 page stories. They require almost their own kind of writing and their own kind of structure, and to tell like a full story with a beginning, middle, and end in only 8 pages is it's tricky. It's, you know, every panel needs to accomplish something, and I really always enjoy that short story challenge.
Over the many comics that you've written, do you have any favorite Easter eggs that you've snuck in? You're like, as you said, you're shocked that you got away with that. But anything that you snuck in, you're like, oh, I'm gonna stick this in from Star Wars Legends, or oh, this is named after my cat.
Oh, well, I'll tell you, probably my favorite Easter egg is I'm a big Billy Joel fan. And when I was working on Spider-Man, I worked in a incredibly obscure Billy Joel song. That actually, like, it was the issue was about Flash Thompson fighting in Iraq. Sorry, fighting in Iraq. Yes. And the song was about the Iraq War, so it was more than just an Easter egg, but it was like, oh, I'm gonna sort of sneak that in. I'm sure there's a million other, like, well, actually, okay, so this is just because it's so fresh, it's so top of mind right now, but there's I'm also doing a run on Planet of the Apes, and I did a 4 issue series called Beware the Planet of the Apes, and the fourth issue, which is out today as we record this, features an Easter egg moment from Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. Where we literally like replicate a shot, and sort of Cornelius does something and says some things that directly parallels what his future son is going to say in Conquest. So that was a nice little like sticking something in there and hoping people catch the parallels.
Yeah, I've talked with some Star Wars creators about how it's important, obviously, to have stories that anyone can read and enjoy, but also if someone happens to be studying it, who knows what they will
That's
find.
That's exactly, yeah, no, that's, I think Easter eggs are great. I work Easter eggs into a lot of my work. And the, the way they should function really is sort of like adult humor in a Pixar movie. Like the kids can still watch it and the jokes will just go over their heads. They won't get the reference or anything. But the adults will, and they'll appreciate it just on a different level. And yeah, I think that's so it's almost an obligation, I think, on the part of writers to get that stuff in there.
Um, so you've also had your hands in a lot of different characters within Star Wars, but if you could write about one topic or character in the future, what would you like to write about?
Ooh, good question. Good question. It's funny. I feel like I wrote a bit of Vader in Star Wars Revelations, and that was a blast. I had so much fun writing him, but for such a short amount of time that's a character I would really love to be able to sort of really delve into. That I think Vader's he's such an interesting character. He's not a to me he's a villain obviously, but he's not just a villain. He's not two-dimensional, and he's so complicated and so tortured. And there's so many different areas of his life that I think are very sort of ripe for story and still worthy of exploration. That it would be fun to do something that was like a purely Vader book.
Yeah. Um, so, do you have any upcoming releases that readers should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, my next thing is a novel, actually. I wrote a novel during the pandemic, and it's coming out in August, on August 1st, through Amazon's Lake Union imprint. And the way I sort of describe it is if Christopher Nolan wrote the movie The Notebook. It's a romance that takes place across parallel universes. So it's sort of a big heady book, but I think it's very grounded. Like you don't need to be a quantum physicist to read it and appreciate it. It's basically about a physicist who is trying to reunite with his deceased wife.
But through parallel, so it's like time and yeah, that's really
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, it's fun. It's because the idea is in my version of the multiverse, there really aren't that many radically different worlds. I sort of say that the universe favors certain outcomes, and in this case, the universe has favored this woman dying. So the antagonist in the novel is actually the multiverse itself. And the multiverse is trying to stop our protagonist, who's really swimming upstream or fighting the will of the universe. And it's a very powerful notion, I think, and it really sort of speaks to the question of how far would you go, for someone you love.
Yeah, I will leave a link to that. If you give me the link to that, then I can give it to our readers when I post it.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
thank
absolutely.
you so much for sitting down with us and to all of our watchers. This is the Wookiee Cast. It's lovely having you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me. This was great. I had a lot of fun.